It was a crisp fall morning in the heart of suburban Georgia, and the bustling streets of Maplewood were just beginning to come alive. Officer Robert Hall adjusted his mirrored sunglasses as he sipped his black coffee, watching the sunrise from the seat of his patrol car. Known around the precinct for his stern demeanor and zero-tolerance attitude, Hall prided himself on keeping the town in line. However, beneath the polished badge and crisp uniform lay a man with deeply ingrained prejudices he had never bothered to confront. That day, Hall was patrolling near Maplewood Elementary School when he noticed a young black girl, no more than 6 years old, running down the street. She wore a pink backpack that bounced with each hurried step. To Hall, she appeared out of place, unsupervised, and, in his mind, suspicious. "Hey," he called out, pulling his cruiser to the curb. The little girl froze mid-step, her large brown eyes filled with confusion and fear. Hall stepped out, towering over her, his shadow stretching across the pavement. "Where are you going?" he demanded, his voice curt. "I'm just going to school," the girl replied softly, clutching the straps of her backpack as though it were a shield. "School? Alone?" Hall's tone was heavy with skepticism. "Where are your parents?" "They're at work," she stammered. Hall's expression hardened. "What's your name?" "Zoe," she whispered. Her timid demeanor only fueled Hall's assumption that something was amiss. "Do you have any ID?" he barked, knowing full well that a child wouldn't carry identification. When Zoe shook her head, tears beginning to form, Hall made a snap decision. "Come with me. You're not supposed to be wandering around like this." He grabbed her wrist, ignoring her protests. "Wait, please. I didn't do anything wrong," Zoe cried, struggling against his grip. Hall, unmoved by her pleas, led her to the back seat of his cruiser. "You can explain it at the station," he said coldly, slamming the door behind her. At the precinct, Hall was met with puzzled glances as he marched Zoe inside. "Picked her up near the school," he announced. "No parents, no ID, and acting suspicious." Officer Melissa Reyes, one of Hall's colleagues, approached with a frown. "She's just a kid, Rob. Are you sure this is necessary?" Hall scoffed. "We can't take any chances these days. Who knows what she's up to?" Reyes knelt down to Zoe's level, offering a reassuring smile. "Sweetheart, do you know your parents' phone number?" she asked gently. Zoe nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Reyes handed her a tissue and led her to a quieter corner to make the call. 30 minutes later, the station doors flew open, and a woman in a tailored suit strode in, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Her presence commanded attention. "Where's my daughter?" she demanded, her voice steady but laced with fury. Hall glanced up, confused. "Your daughter?" "Yes," the woman snapped, her piercing gaze cutting through him. "I'm Inspector Lila Carter, Internal Affairs." She reached into her bag and produced a badge, holding it up for everyone to see. "And that little girl you just arrested? She's my child." Hall's face drained of color as the weight of his actions hit him. Whispers rippled through the room, and Reyes shot him a pointed glare. Inspector Carter didn't wait for an explanation. "I need to see her. Now." The room was silent as Hall, now visibly shaken, led her to where Zoe sat. The moment Zoe saw her mother, she burst into tears, running into her arms. Lila knelt, holding her daughter close. "It's okay, baby. Mummy's here." She kissed Zoe's forehead before standing, her expression shifting to one of controlled rage. Turning to Hall, she said in a voice that cut like ice, "You and I need to have a conversation. In private." In a small interrogation room adjacent to the station's main office, Inspector Lila Carter stood across from Officer Hall. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating. Hall fidgeted nervously, his usual air of confidence gone. Lila's presence was commanding, her tailored suit a sharp contrast to Hall's wrinkled uniform. "Let's start with this," Lila began, her voice controlled but firm. "Explain to me why you thought it was appropriate to detain a 6-year-old child on her way to school." Hall swallowed hard. "Ma'am, she was running down the street alone. No ID, no supervision. Looked suspicious to me." "Suspicious," Lila repeated, her tone cutting. She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. "Tell me, Officer Hall, what about my daughter looked suspicious to you? Was it her backpack, her pink sneakers, or was it the color of her skin?" Hall's face flushed red. "With all due respect, ma'am, I was following protocol. Kids wandering alone can be victims of neglect, or worse." "Neglect?" Lila snapped, her composure slipping for a moment. "You didn't ask her a single question about her situation before throwing her in the back of your cruiser. Did you think for one second that there might be another explanation?" Hall shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed on the table. I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing," Lila said, her voice rising. "The right thing would have been to treat her like any other child, like a person. Instead, you treated her like a suspect. She's 6 years old." Hall opened his mouth to respond, but Lila cut him off. "Do you have children, Officer Hall?" He hesitated before shaking his head. "Then let me paint you a picture," Lila continued, her tone deadly calm. "Imagine your niece or nephew being pulled off the street by a stranger, taken to a police station, and treated like a criminal, all because they happened to be walking alone. Now imagine that child crying, scared out of their mind, wondering what they did wrong." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling heavily on Hall's shoulders. Meanwhile, outside the room, the station buzzed with whispers. News of the confrontation had spread quickly, and officers gathered in clusters, their expressions a mix of unease and curiosity. "She's ripping him apart in there," Officer Reyes whispered to her partner, shaking her head. "And honestly, he deserves it." "Yeah, but this is going to make waves," her partner replied, glancing toward the closed door. "You don't cross internal affairs without consequences." Back in the interrogation room, Lila straightened up, her voice steady but colder now. "Let me make one thing clear, Officer Hall. My daughter isn't just some random kid you can intimidate because you're wearing a badge. She's my world, and I will not stand by while someone treats her, or any child, like this." Hall nodded meekly, but Lila wasn't done. "You're not the only one who's going to answer for this," she said, her eyes narrowing. "The culture in this station, the one that allows incidents like this to happen, needs to change, and I will make sure it does." Hall's mouth went dry. "Ma'am, I didn't mean any harm." "Harm doesn't require intent, Officer Hall," Lila replied sharply. "It requires action, or inaction. And today, your actions harmed my daughter." The door to the interrogation room opened, and Captain Bryant, the station's commanding officer, stepped inside. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, Bryant exuded authority, though his expression was strained. "Inspector Carter," he began, his voice low and placating. "May I have a word?" Lila turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "This had better be good, Captain." In Bryant's office, the tension was no less palpable. The blinds were drawn, and the hum of the air conditioning filled the silence as the captain took his seat behind the desk. "First, let me say I'm deeply sorry for what happened to your daughter," Bryant began. "I take full responsibility for the actions of my officers." "Good," Lila replied, her arms crossed, "because what happened today is unacceptable. Officer Hall's behavior is a symptom of a much larger issue, one that your leadership has clearly failed to address." Bryant sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Inspector, I assure you, we've made strides in improving community relations." "Clearly not enough," Lila interrupted. "Do you know how often black children are treated like criminals in this country? Do you understand the psychological damage that causes? Your strides mean nothing if incidents like this are still happening." Bryant looked at her, his expression weary. "What do you want, Inspector? An apology? Disciplinary action?" "I want accountability," Lila said firmly. "For Officer Hall and for this entire department. This isn't just about my daughter. It's about every marginalized family in this town who's had to endure similar treatment." Bryant nodded slowly, recognizing the determination in her eyes. "You'll have it," he said finally. "Hall will be suspended pending an internal review, and I'll personally oversee the investigation." "That's a start," Lila replied, her tone softening slightly. "But I'll be watching closely, Captain. If I don't see meaningful change, I won't hesitate to escalate this to the state level, or higher." Bryant's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Understood." As Lila left his office, the weight of her mission settled on her shoulders. She knew this was just the beginning of a long battle, but she was ready to fight, for Zoe, for Maplewood, and for every child who deserved better. The next morning, Lila Carter sat in her home office, a cup of coffee steaming beside her as she reviewed the official police report from the incident. It was as frustrating as she expected, short, sanitized, and devoid of critical details. Officer Hall's justification for detaining Zoe was framed as a precautionary measure, his actions attributed to his concern for public safety. The words infuriated her. They painted Hall as a hero, not the perpetrator of an act that had traumatized her daughter. Lila's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Captain Bryant. "Inspector Carter." His deep voice greeted her when she answered. "I wanted to inform you that Officer Hall has been placed on administrative leave while we conduct the internal review." "That's a good start," Lila replied coolly. "But I need more than discipline. I need systemic reform." Bryant sighed audibly. "I understand your position, but these things take time. Policy changes, training. It's not something that happens overnight." "Time is a luxury some families don't have, Captain," Lila said sharply. "I'll be visiting the station today to begin my own assessment. I expect your full cooperation." "Of course," Bryant replied, though the hesitation in his tone didn't escape her. By noon, Lila arrived at the precinct. The air inside was heavy with unease. Officers avoided her gaze as she walked through the halls, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Lila didn't care. She had a job to do. Reyes greeted her outside the conference room, her expression a mix of sympathy and quiet determination. "Inspector Carter, thank you for coming. I've set up the reports you requested, incident histories, community complaints, and use of force records." "Good work, Officer Reyes," Lila said, offering her a rare smile. "I appreciate your efficiency." Reyes hesitated, then said, "Ma'am, if I may, what happened to your daughter isn't an isolated incident. I've seen things, nothing extreme, but enough to make me uncomfortable. People in this town have been voicing concerns for years." Lila's brows furrowed. "Why hasn't anything been done?" Reyes looked down, fidgeting with her pen. "Fear, I guess. Officers don't want to rock the boat, and the community doesn't trust us enough to push harder." "Well, that's going to change," Lila said firmly. Over the next several hours, Lila pored over the documents. Patterns began to emerge. Arrests disproportionately targeting minorities, excessive use of force in predominantly black neighborhoods, and a steady stream of civilian complaints that seemed to vanish without resolution. Her stomach tightened as she read the details of one particular case. A 14-year-old black boy detained for loitering outside a convenience store. The officer involved had been none other than Hall. "He's done this before," Lila muttered, her frustration boiling over. Reyes, who had remained nearby, leaned in to look. "I remember that case. The boy's parents filed a complaint, but it went nowhere. Hall claimed the boy fit the description of a robbery suspect, and the department backed him." Lila's jaw clenched. Typical. It's easier to protect their own than admit wrongdoing. That evening, Lila sat across from Captain Bryant in his office, the stack of reports between them. "Captain, these findings are damning," she said, her voice steady but laced with anger. "Your department isn't just failing the community, it's actively harming it." Bryant leaned back in his chair, his expression tired. "Inspector, I won't argue with your findings, I know our department has issues, but fixing them isn't as simple as firing a few officers or revising a handbook. It's a culture problem, and those take time to uproot. Then we start now, Lila said. I want mandatory bias training for every officer, an independent review board for civilian complaints, and a complete overhaul of your community outreach initiatives. Bryant rubbed his temples. You're asking for a lot. I'm asking for what's necessary, Lila countered. You can either work with me to make these changes, or I'll bring this to the State Attorney General. Your call. After a long pause, Bryant nodded reluctantly. You'll have my support. As the conversation ended, Reyes knocked on the door. Inspector Carter, there's someone here to see you. Who is it? Lila asked, surprised. It's Zoe's teacher, Miss Patel, Reyes replied. Lila's expression softened. Send her in. In the station's break room, Lila sat with Miss Patel, a young woman with kind eyes and a determined demeanor. Inspector Carter, I wanted to check on Zoe, Ms. Patel said. She seemed withdrawn in class today. She's usually so lively, but after what happened? Lila felt a pang of guilt. She's shaken. She didn't even want to go to school this morning, and that's not like her. Ms. Patel nodded, then hesitated. I also wanted to share something. I've heard from other parents about how their children have been treated, followed by officers, questioned for no reason, even detained. They don't speak up because they're afraid it'll make things worse. Lila's eyes narrowed. Thank you for telling me, Miss Patel. I promise you things are going to change. And if those parents are willing to talk, I want to hear their stories. As the teacher left, Lila felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about Zoe anymore. It was about every child in Maplewood who deserved to feel safe and valued. With the precinct's leadership on notice and the community starting to rally, the battle for accountability had begun in earnest. But Lila knew the hardest part was yet to come. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Maplewood's community center, where Lila had arranged a meeting with local parents and residents. The room was modest, but filled with a quiet energy as families began to file in. Many wore expressions of weariness, their trust in the system eroded by years of mistreatment. Zoe clung to Lila's hand as they entered, her presence reminding everyone of why they were there. Despite her youth, her story had already become a rallying cry for change. Mommy, will this help other kids? Zoe asked softly. Lila knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. It will, sweetie. You're so brave for being here. Zoe nodded, her small shoulders straightening with resolve. As the meeting began, Lila stood at the front of the room, her voice clear and steady. Thank you all for coming, she began. I know many of you have experienced or witnessed injustices in our town, and I want you to know, this is a safe space. Today, we're here to listen, to share, and to plan a way forward. She gestured to the whiteboard behind her, which bore the words, Community Accountability, a Path to Change. One by one, people began to speak. My son was stopped walking home from the library, said a mother near the front, her voice shaking. The officer said he looked out of place. He's 12. How could he look out of place in his own neighborhood? A father stood, his jaw tight with anger. My daughter's car broke down last year. She called for help, but the officer who showed up accused her of stealing it. She had to call me to prove it was hers. More stories followed, accounts of profiling, baseless stops, and unwarranted searches. Each testimony painted a picture of a community under siege by those sworn to protect it. As the meeting continued, a young man named Malik raised his hand. He was in his early 20s, his posture tense but his eyes determined. I don't know if this is the right place to say this, Malik began, but I've been harassed by Officer Hall more times than I can count. He stops me for no reason, searches my car, and always makes these snide comments, stay out of trouble, or you don't belong here. Lila nodded. Thank you for sharing, Malik. You're absolutely in the right place. This isn't just about one incident. It's about every time someone's dignity has been stripped away. We're here to make sure that stops." As the stories piled up, Lila felt both anger and determination swelling within her. She knew she couldn't let these voices fade into the void of bureaucratic inaction. "Here's what we're going to do," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "We'll document every story shared here today. Dates, names, details. I'll compile them into a report and submit it to the State Attorney General's office. We'll demand an independent investigation into the Maplewood Police Department." The room buzzed with murmurs of approval, but Lila held up a hand. "That's just the first step," she continued. "We're also forming a community oversight committee. This group will act as a watchdog for the department, ensuring accountability in every interaction." Reyes, who had quietly attended the meeting, stood up. "I'll volunteer as the department's liaison to the committee. We need people on the inside who are committed to change." Lila smiled. "Thank you, Officer Reyes. Your support means everything." As the meeting wrapped up, Lila noticed an older woman lingering near the back of the room. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes held a quiet wisdom. "Inspector Carter," the woman said, approaching. "My name's Miss Eleanor. I've lived in Maplewood all my life, and I've seen this town at its best and its worst. What you're doing here, it gives me hope." "Thank you, Miss Eleanor," Lila said, shaking her hand. "But," Eleanor continued, "you should know that change won't come easy. There'll be pushback, from the department, from some in the community. They'll try to make you feel like you're fighting a losing battle." Lila straightened her shoulders. "I've faced battles before, Miss Eleanor, and I don't intend to lose this one." The older woman nodded, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Good. Because this town needs someone like you." That evening, back at home, Lila sat with Zoe on the couch. The day's events replayed in her mind, every story, every tear, every promise. "Mommy?" Zoe asked, her voice small. "Yes, baby? Are the police going to stop being mean to people like me?" Lila pulled her daughter close, her heart aching. "They will, Zoe. I'll make sure of it." As Zoe drifted off to sleep, Lila stared at the ceiling, her resolve hardening. This fight wasn't just for her daughter. It was for every person who deserved to live without fear. The road ahead would be long, but Lila was ready. And she wouldn't stop until Maplewood was a town where every child could run down the street without being seen as suspicious. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The Community Oversight Committee was officially established, and Lila, alongside volunteers like Malik, Ms. Patel, and Miss Eleanor, began working tirelessly. Officer Reyes became an invaluable ally, providing insight into the department's inner workings. The report compiled by the committee was damning. It documented years of unchecked bias, misconduct, and systemic failures. Lila submitted the report to the State Attorney General's office, along with a petition signed by hundreds of Maplewood residents demanding change. The story gained traction beyond Maplewood. Local news outlets began covering the movement, and soon, state and national media picked it up. The headline, "Racist Cop Detains 6-Year-Old, Inspires Town's Fight for Justice," spread like wildfire. In response to the public outcry, the State Attorney General's office launched an independent investigation into the Maplewood Police Department. For the first time, officers like Hall were subjected to scrutiny they couldn't avoid. Hall, who had been on administrative leave, now faced suspension without pay as evidence of his pattern of discriminatory behavior surfaced. The investigation uncovered multiple complaints against him that had been swept under the rug, including the incident with the 14-year-old boy Malik had mentioned. But Hall wasn't the only one exposed. The investigation revealed a culture of complacency within the department. Officers who had looked the other way or actively participated in similar behaviors were now being held accountable. Despite the progress, there was resistance. At a town hall meeting held to discuss the investigation, a group of angry residents, led by a local businessman, confronted Lila and the Oversight Committee. "This investigation is a witch hunt," the man shouted. "You're painting all the officers as villains. They put their lives on the line for us every day." Lila stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "No one here is saying every officer is a villain. What we're saying is that bad behavior, when left unchecked, endangers everyone, including the good officers. Accountability isn't an attack. It's a necessity." The crowd murmured, divided between agreement and dissent. Lila pressed on. "I'm here because my daughter, my 6-year-old daughter, was treated like a criminal for walking to school. If we don't address this now, how many more children will it happen to? How many families will feel the same fear and anger that mine did?" The room fell silent, and the businessman, though still visibly angry, sat down. The investigation concluded with a series of sweeping reforms. Several officers resigned or were terminated, including Hall. New policies were implemented, including mandatory bias training, body cameras for all officers, and a system for tracking and addressing civilian complaints. The Community Oversight Committee was given a permanent role in reviewing departmental practices, ensuring that the people of Maplewood had a voice in how they were policed. On a bright spring day, 6 months after the incident, the town gathered at Maplewood Elementary School for the dedication of a new playground. The initiative had been funded by local donations and designed as a symbol of hope and unity. Lila stood near the ribbon, holding Zoe's hand. The little girl had been quiet, but determined in the months since her ordeal, and today her smile was brighter than ever. When the time came for the ribbon cutting, Captain Bryant approached the microphone. His demeanor had softened over the months as he worked to rebuild trust with the community. "Today we take a step forward," Bryant began, his voice steady. "Not just as a department, but as a town. This playground is a symbol of what we can achieve when we listen, when we learn, and when we work together." He gestured toward Lila. "And none of this would have been possible without the courage of one mother who refused to stay silent." The crowd erupted in applause as Lila, slightly taken aback, stepped forward. She took the microphone, her voice carrying across the crowd. "This playground is more than swings and slides. It's a promise, to our children and to each other, that Maplewood will be a place where every child feels safe, valued, and free to just be a kid. Thank you for standing with us and for believing in a better future." As the ribbon was cut and the children swarmed the playground, Lila knelt beside Zoe, watching her climb the jungle gym with newfound confidence. "You did this, Mommy," Zoe said, her eyes shining. Lila smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "No, baby, we did this." The fight for justice wasn't over, but that day, Maplewood took its first steps toward becoming a town where every child could run free, unafraid and full of hope. And for Lila, that was just the beginning.